Hello and welcome back. This is Dawn with another video for PinkFresh Studio. So today I'm going to be making a duo of cards featuring the Butterflies in Bloom product suite, and I'm going to be pairing them with the Judy Uppercase Alpha. Now this may be an unconventional pairing, but I'm going to show you how they can work together beautifully. Now the Butterflies in Bloom product suite has the stamp set, press plate, a coordinating die, and then of course the stencils to help you color in the images, and all of these can be purchased together or separately, but they all work together. And then of course the Judy Uppercase Alpha, which is this beautiful serif font that has this pierced detail. Jumping right in, I'm going to start with my stamping, and I'm going to be using the Butterflies in Bloom stamp set for my cards today. But you could also do this exact same card using the press plates and hot foil or letterpress. And I'll have a sample to show you with the hot foil. So I'm going to go ahead and do my stamping in brown. I'm going to be using the Better Press Bark ink today. This is a nice neutral brown that I can either stamp once or twice for a lighter color, or I can build it up with multiple stampings to make it a little bit darker. And I did have to stamp mine a couple extra times because my ink pad is running dry, but no worries. I do have a re-inker on the way, so I use this one a lot. It's one of my favorites for stamping. And with that done, we can move on to adding color. And again, we're going to use the Butterflies in Bloom stencil here to add our color. And there are 4 layers included in this stencil set. So each of the large flowers has 2 layers. The butterflies have 2 layers, and then everything else is just 1 layer. This is a great beginner stencil. It's also great if you are advanced and experienced at blending. Because the areas are quite open and large, you get to decide where you want to add the detail. So again, this is one of those that I think is great for beginners, but it's also really good for experienced ink blending, and I'll show you some tips today on how to kind of add in your own details. So with stencil number 1, I'm going to start with passion fruit for our large flowers here. I'm going to use the 1/2 inch blending brushes, and I'm going to start in the center. I like to start in the center. Now on this large flower here, you can see there is this little piece of stencil. It's only attached on one side, so it can wiggle from side to side. So I like to kind of use my finger to hold that in place so that it doesn't shift back and forth. Just something to be aware of. All right, I'm going to start by adding my heaviest color right in the center. So as soon as I ink up my brush, I dot it off on the plastic sheet, and then I come right in the center and I'll make small circles. And then I will gradually have my circles get larger and extend out to cover more of the petal. Now this is going to deposit most of the ink closest to the center of the flower, and then slowly blend that ink out to a much softer color towards the tips of the petals. So you can see here, I'm just going to work my way, concentrating the bulk of the ink toward the center and then allowing it to just fade out to a very, very light pink there at the edges of the petals. Now, alternatively, if you wanted the tips of the petals to be dark and the center of the flower to be light, you would do the opposite. You would start at the edges of the petals with the deposit of the color and then work your way towards the center. Again, wherever you put your brush down first after you ink it is where you're going to get the heaviest application of color. Now I'll just repeat the same steps here for the second flower, again starting in the center with my heaviest color and then making my circles bigger as I extend out towards the tips of the petals. Now once I've got that base layer down, I can come in and add some details. Now, if you have the 1/4 inch brushes, this would be a great time to use them. However, if you only have the 1/2 inch brush, you can make do with that as well. What I'm going to do is just use the very side of the brush. So I'm kind of holding the brush at a 45-degree angle so that I'm only using that very edge. You can see there how it's a little bit flat. It's because I am just tilting it on its side, and then I'm using just that edge to get a more targeted application of color. So anywhere that these petals are laying one on top of the other, I can use that very edge to just darken up that back petal. And you can just use the lines from the stamp to guide you as to where to put just a little bit more darker color. And it's not going to be hugely apparent until we take off the stencil, and you can just see that it's like a shade darker. It's nothing huge, but it does make a big difference, trust me. So here you can see I'm just deepening up the very base of any petal that is behind another one. And again, holding that brush at a 45-degree angle and just using the very edge of it helps to give me that more targeted application. So I'm just going to keep doing this for the rest of my petals here. Again, this is totally optional and you don't have to do every single petal. Remember, it's all about suggestion. The power of suggestion is strong. So if you just add this little detail in a couple places here and there, it really brings the whole image to life without you having to do it everywhere. But of course, you can add as much detail as you want. That is the beautiful thing about this stencil. It is open enough for you to add in your own details, but it also looks beautiful just flatly colored for a beginner. So either way, you are going to end up with a beautiful image. So now that we've got the stencil one of those flowers done, we're going to go ahead and do these butterflies. It's going to be quite simple. I'm going to use Sunkissed, and just like I did with the flowers, I'm going to start at the very edge of the wing, and then I'm going to progressively make my circles get larger towards the edge. I want that gradation of color. I want it to be nice and vibrant there where the wing meets the body, and then I want it to slowly, gradually get lighter and lighter towards the tip of the wing. You'll also notice that I'm going in both directions. So I will do clockwise circles and counterclockwise circles. This is just going to help to get that ink in every nook and cranny of the stencil opening. Now, likewise, if you're more comfortable doing a flicking motion, you can get a similar effect here. You would just start at the base of the wing and flick out towards the tip. And then you would come in and do your little circles at the base. So you would go clockwise and then counterclockwise and then clockwise. And that's going to build up that color at the very base of the wing. So either way is going to work just fine. It's whatever you're more comfortable with. Now, if you want to add just a little bit of variation to your flowers here, I'm going to take that Sunkissed and I'm going to ever so slightly just add a little bit of that Sunkissed in just a couple spots to this flower. That's it. Maybe one or two areas. But I just want to bring a little bit of the warmth from that Sunkissed into the flower. And again, it's just going to add a little bit of interest so that we don't have one flat color on our flowers. This is another one of those things that's not really going to show up until we remove the stencil. So you can see here, I'll hold this up close for you so you can see both far away and up close. But here you can already see there's just a little something different about the flowers. You can't quite tell what it is until you look here up close, and you can see that little bit of Sunkissed in just a couple of spots on our flowers here. All right, we're going to repeat these same steps with the rest of the layers. So you're going to put stencil number 2 in place, line that up, and then do your stenciling. Again, add as much or as little detail as you want. Now for the second layer of these larger flowers, I'm going to go in with Coral Reef instead of the passion fruit. Coral Reef is one shade lighter. You can see here I'm thinking about it, and this is where I make my decision. I want to add even more contrast here, but I know that it's easy to get heavy-handed, and I'll end up with both of these layers being the passion fruit in the same intensity, which would not look bad, but I can dial myself back. I can almost hold myself back if I just go a shade lighter, or I can make it super intense by going a shade darker, or you could even go with a completely different color for these for this layer, and that would look equally as beautiful. And I'll have a sample to show you in the second card where on this layer I used the Sunkissed versus the Coral Reef. So on the first layer I used the Coral Reef and the passion fruit, and on the second layer, this layer right here, I used the Sunkissed, and it just added a little variation, but they weren't so far apart that my flower looked like it had totally different color petals. You'll see it. You'll see it, trust me. So here, same technique. I will start with smaller concentric circles where I want my color to be the heaviest, and then I will gradually make my circles get larger so that the color is lighter and has this beautiful gradation of color. So I continued to build up those darks until I was happy. Now I can move on to the next stencil, and for that we're using Warm Buff for the flower centers and the butterfly bodies. I'm going to put down a base layer of this Warm Buff, which is a nice light, warm, almost creamy brown. And then I'm going to add just a little bit of detail around the edges using gathered twigs. This is going to add just a little bit of depth. And then for those small star-shaped flowers, I'm using apricot, and I'm applying a very uneven layer of color here. So in some areas, I'm leaving it very light, and then I'm just coming in here and there and adding a little bit heavier application of that color. Again, just going to add a little bit of variation. So we'll remove that stencil, and then we can move on to our final stencil. And this one is going to color in the leaves. So I'm starting off with a very light layer of limoncello. Now you could come straight in with grassy knoll or maybe key lime, olive. These would all look beautiful. I like to blend my own greens. It's kind of a quirk of mine. It's probably a little extra, but I have fun creating varying shades of green. I do a lot of gardening, and I happen to notice all of the different shades of green in the garden. So it's something that just carries over into my crafting as well. So I started with a light layer of limoncello. This is going to give me that sun-kissed look on some of the leaves. It's going to create a beautiful gradation of color from a blue-green into a yellow-green. So now I'm coming in with sage, which is more of a muted blue-green. And I'm starting right in the center with this sage, so I'm going to make it a little bit deeper and more green here on the stem and the where the leaves meet the stem, but I'm going to allow it to kind of fade out toward the edges so that more of that limoncello stays visible. So again, this is going to give me a gradation from a blue-green into a very yellow-green and give the illusion that the leaves are maybe being kissed by sunlight. And you'll really be able to see that here when I remove the stencil. Now you may have noticed that I've been working this entire time on my stamp wheel surface. I have not removed my paper and my stamp is still on my acrylic plate. This is because sometimes when you ink blend, especially oranges over browns, it can mute your stamping lines. This way I can now come in and stamp my image again right on top. Nothing has moved. Everything is still in the exact same place, and I'm going to get a perfect stamped impression over my ink blending to just re-crisp those lines back up and really make them stand out. All right, so with the stenciling done, I used the coordinating die to cut out my images. Again, this is one of those where all of the images are on one die, so you just have to line it up once, run it through, and you've got all of your pieces. And off camera, I went ahead and created 2 more variations. So on the left there, we have the one that we just did in the corals and the oranges. And then on the far right, I did a very similar one with the same color palette, but that's the one I went much lighter. And then on the second layer, I did the oranges. Now here in the center, I used the press plate with my glimmer machine to foil this in gold, and then I opted for some cooler tones with my stenciling. I went with purples and blues, and then I used the warm buff for the little flowers and the flower centers. Absolutely love how this one turned out, and I hit those tips of those petals with the blues, and that's going to match with those butterflies. I don't use this in today's video, but I'm excited to create a card with this one. So let's go ahead and turn the other 2 into cards. So off camera, I die cut several phrases using that Jody uppercase alpha. I did celebrate, thanks, and grateful, and I die cut several of each letter so that I could stack them for a little bit more dimension. I knew I wanted to go with these large, bold phrases and accent them with the florals, and I was also inspired by Vintage Postage. So I grabbed the Nested Rectangles Postage Edge die set, and I grabbed the largest die here. This is just under an A2 card size, and I've die cut that from white cardstock. I love how this little pierced detail here on the edge of these postage dies matches the pierced detail in our letters here. It's kind of like they were made for each other. So I thought that that was just a great little detail that really kind of marries the two. I love it when things like that just come together. All right, at this point, I'm still working out my design. So I've transferred my letters, the grateful phrase, over to my base here, over to my panel. And I'm kind of have to try to decide how I want to work these florals in with our sentiment. I still want the sentiment to be able to be read. I want it to, obviously, it's the important part of the card. But I do want them to have a relationship. So I don't want it to look like they are 2 separate items. I want to kind of weave them together and make them look like they belong together. So some of the letters will be on top of the florals, some of them will be underneath partially, but the important part here is that the sentiment is still legible. And I like how this looks, but I still feel like it needs a little something. It still feels just a little plain. And since the Vintage Postage is my inspiration here, a lot of the times they have a colored background and then the edges of the postage are white. So I grabbed my Post-it removable labeling tape here, and I'm going to use that to mask off the edges. Now the great thing about this die is it's got that pierced dotted detail there along the edges. That's going to be perfect straight line for me to line this tape up with to make sure that I get A, an even border, and B, a straight border. Then I came in with my 1-inch blending brush and Ocean Breeze and added some color to the background here. Now I didn't go in with an even coverage from edge to edge. I did want some variation in the depth of color in the background. So in some areas I went a little bit heavier and built up the color, and in other areas I left it very light. Now this was giving me a little bit more green than I wanted. So a tip for you is if you want to push a color to, say here, I want to go a little bit more blue, I'm going to come in with sky blue and I'm just going to lightly blend that right over it. It's not going to completely change the color, but it is going to push it a little bit more blue and a little less green. And then of course it's time for all of our favorite part, the reveal. So when you remove your masking paper here, you'll be able to see those nice crisp lines. You'll also notice that it looks a lot darker once you remove the masking paper. That's another tip that I can give you is to check your progress. You can always lift the edge to see how dark it really is, because it always looks lighter when the masking paper is still down. So then all I had to do is transfer that design onto the background, and I think that this looks much better than just the plain white background. And I love how that green is just dark enough for those white letters to stand out, but not so dark that it takes away from the light, airy feeling of this overall design. So here we pretty much use the entire floral image. But for the next card, I want to show you how you can cut up that floral arrangement and use it with a similar design using a different phrase. Okay, so for this one, I went ahead and did the same treatment to the background, except I used warm buff. So I went ahead and used a 1-inch blending brush, inked that warm buff into the background, and we're going to pair this with the darker colored flowers. I thought that the lighter background set off these darker florals a little bit better. So for this one, we have less letters. We have thanks. It's only 6 letters. And I'm going to kind of arrange the thanks in the way that I've laid them out on the mat there in the left, which means I have some blank areas. I have a blank area there beside the H, and then I have a little hole there beside the A on the second line. And so I figured that this is going to be a good place to tuck some of these florals into. So if I have that largest flower there on the left side, I can go ahead and lay these letters out onto my panel here and kind of do a dry run. Now I'm going to take entirely too long to figure this out. If you've seen me craft, if you've taken any of my classes, you know I'm an overthinker, but it allows me to kind of get an idea for different layouts while I'm testing this layout. So like I've mentioned in many videos, there's many ways that this could work. And as I'm laying this out and playing with it, I'm kind of, putting a pin in ideas that I think could also work. Because remember, I do have another one of these florals already ink blended. So if I choose to make another card that says, celebrate, I can keep that idea in the back of my head and maybe apply it to the next card. So it's just a way for me to stretch ideas without having to start over from scratch. And as I initially lay these out, it's going to look a little off because my thanks are not lined up vertically. I am staggering each line a little bit, and I'm doing that intentionally. I'm leaving spaces or gaps in the background that I can then fill in with elements of our florals or the butterflies. So you can see here, I'm going to test putting this K and this S a little further over to the left, and it looks a little odd right here, but if I chop off that flower here on the left side, I'm going to have the remainder of that flower to bring over to the other side of the design. So you can see here, I'll lay this cardstock down. You can see how up top that looks great, but we've got that bare spot there in the right corner. Well, if we take that piece that we end up chopping off here and we move that to the bottom corner, that's going to fill in that gap, and it's not going to look funny. It's going to look like it's all part of the design. And here you can better see that I've trimmed that flower motif in half. And if we add this piece here in the lower left-hand corner, or the lower right-hand corner, it's going to fill in that hole. We're also going to be able to trim off some of the bottom of that flower, and that's going to give us a little bit more to add into a third area of the card, because working in 3s is always good. We like those odd numbers, right? And a visual triangle. So I could add this over here on the left side. And you can see how well that fits in. And now all we have to do is decide where we want to place our letters. Again, we're going to do some in front of and some behind the florals there. And this is going to weave them in and out of each other. And as long as we can tell what letter's back there so that the sentiment is still legible, it'll work. And then I went ahead and adhered everything using the press and seal method. I used a mix of foam adhesive and liquid adhesive. For the florals in the background, I went ahead and popped them up. So that meant I had to use foam adhesive wherever the letters overlapped those. And I like that we still have a bit of dimension and interest here, even though this is a rather simple design. All right, now once I had finished both of these panels, I was torn. I sat on it for a day. And I loved this one. I thought there was just enough contrast, but I thought this one needed some more work. Looking back at this, I don't know if I like the changes that I made better or not. I'd love to hear your opinion on it, but let's take a look at the changes that I did make. I felt like the letters, they didn't stand out enough against the background. So I took a sheet of cardstock here and I ink blended it using the warm buff, and then I added a little bit of dough as well, just to give it a little bit more depth. And then I went about seeing if I could deconstruct some of this without destroying it because I had already adhered everything. Luckily, I was able to, the only thing I had to remove was the butterfly, and I was going to be replacing that H anyway, so it wasn't a big deal. Then I simply adhered all of the new letters on top of the old ones, and I was able to tuck them in without any problem whatsoever. So a little bit of liquid adhesive on top of the letters and then simply laying those new ones on top. And I was able to change the color of the letters. Now again, in hindsight, I don't know if this was the best idea. I also ended up changing those orange butterflies to purple butterflies. I just thought that now that we had more contrast, the purple butterflies looked better, especially with that warm buff. I really like the way the candy violet looks with that warm buff. I think it's a beautiful color combination. After this, all I had to do was adhere these to a card base. So let's go ahead and review both of the finished cards. So here they are. First up, we have the florals that we created here on camera. I do love this card. I think I changed the whole vibe of it though, and I really liked the very soft thanks and then the orange butterflies. I don't know. I'm still torn. I'm still torn which one I like better, but I think that they're still absolutely beautiful. This one, I love the very soft romantic feel that this has, and those blue butterflies pop. I think that this one is probably my favorite, honestly. You guys know I'm a sucker for those soft vintage colors. I'd love to know your thoughts below. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and you picked up a new tip or two. If so, don't forget to like, and if you haven't already, make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss any future videos. All of the featured products will be linked in the description box below, and as always, I want to thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time. Bye.